They say a sniper in one of the corners of the hut got this Marine through the leg. This is a note for New York. In some of the shots of that wounded guy being carried out, I'm afraid I may be in some of those shots. Please cut those shots out. It wasn't a case of wanting to be in a picture, believe me. It was that. We'll try to watch it.
No soldier worthy of the name will leave even a dead comrade on the field of battle and abandon him. You hear a lot about the Viet Cong refusing to leave their dead on a field of battle if they could possibly avoid it. What you don't hear so much about are the efforts of our own men. This outfit, a company from the 1st Infantry Division's 1st Brigade, was rained on yesterday, rained on all night, rained on again this morning. But they're going to stay out here until they find the body of Rudolph Nunes. Now, you saw him hit, did you?
So I certainly did. When he got hit, I thought he was hit in the chest. He grabbed his chest and spun around and fell on his face.
Then you tried to get to him?
Yes, I got, well, prior to me getting to him, I killed the man that shot him. Then I got within about 2 feet of him, and 3 more VCs jumped up within 15 foot from us, and I opened up on them, and all 3 of them fell. And at this time, the Viet Cong opened up from all directions. That was pretty well boxed in. You work with 5 men, and you stay out in the jungle, sometimes 5 days at a time. You see nobody but those 5 men, and everybody gets to be just like brothers. And you get where you think of, well, there's no way to describe it. It's the best friend you could ever have. And it really hurts.
Here is Dan Rather speaking directly from Galveston.
In evacuation of all islands and low coastal areas along the Louisiana and the upper and central Texas coast has not been completed, evacuation should be hastened before it is too late. Every precautionary measure should be taken now to protect life and property against dangerous winds and tides. As of the moment, Hurricane Carla is centered near latitude 26.0 north and 92.9 west. That's 255 miles southeast of Galveston, Texas, and keep in mind that that's where the center of the hurricane is located. This is a hurricane that's very wide across, running roughly some 400 miles completely across it. The center is now located 255 statute miles southeast of Galveston. Highest winds are still estimated at 135 miles per hour near the center of the hurricane. And hurricane-force winds, that's winds of 73 miles per hour or better, extend outward 100 miles to the north and 50 miles to the south of the hurricane's center. Glenn, I wonder if you could explain to us about this business of the eye of the hurricane. Many people know this, but there's still many people who do not know, understand about this eye of the hurricane. And since we are in the path where the eye of the hurricane is expected to pass over, I understand that right in the middle of the hurricane, this is a diagram roughly of the eye of the hurricane, the counterclockwise movement. This is the general direction. Let's say we're in Galveston here, and it's moving in this direction. Now, when the eye passes over, this area in here, according to the latest advisory, is about 40 or 50 miles across, isn't it? That's correct. Now, the winds in here are theoretically quieter. In fact, at point zero, it's practically calm, is it not?
Yes, you may not have an absolute calm, but you can get very light winds, in some cases near calm. And
go ahead.
Excuse me. This is one point we want to stress. We want to stress that people should not assume that the storm is over. You might even get a break in the clouds and possibly even see a little sunshine for a few minutes.
This is after the first hard rain and hard wind of the center or the eye of the hurricane passing your way. Then you may even get a break in the clouds, sunshine, some calm.
All right, sunshine is daytime. If the center would go in at night, which is possible, of course, you could see stars.
All right, now it could be that this calm area would last in a storm this big, and with the eye this big, and as slow as this storm is moving, a couple of hours even.
It's possible, but the main point to emphasize that even though conditions temporarily improve and winds subside in the center, you still have the second half of the storm to pass over.
And the winds will then be coming from the other direction.
Winds will become strong again, dangerously strong from the opposite direction.
Thank you very much, and of course we'll be calling on you and the others more and more as the day goes along and this thing moves closer. Mr. Rockney, can we move into the radar room now? There is the eye of the hurricane, right there. You can see it very clearly on the radar. A beautiful picture from our radar area in there now. No, if you're available, fine, but we don't need. All right, fine. Mr. Rockney is going to be in with us in just a few moments to explain the situation on the eye. There's the hurricane eye right there as the radar makes the sweep over it. Now we're taking the map off, and again you can see what the radar has. Now some of that cloudy area, what appears to be cloudy area right around where the radar sweep is originating from, is part of a ground flutter, what they call it. That out in the Gulf is the real McCoy, a lot of rain, a lot of wind out there, heading in the direction of Aransas Pass and Galveston, that general area of the coast through there. Rockney, how are things over in the radar room?
Just a minute, and I'll have the fellow stand away from the radar screen and we'll pick up.
All right, well, don't interrupt anything they're doing there now. If Mr. Rockney is going into the radar room, now there's shots of our cameras on the radar. And Dan Rather and Galveston back now to you.
Mississippi. The Pearl River has been at flood stage of one kind or another for almost 4 months, ever since December. This winter and spring have been the worst for flooding. Can you and the family get out here, get in and out?
By boat.
But you just continue to live on the inside.
Everything we have is here. Kind of have to stay with it.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks.
These are about 4 of the calmest people in a flood I've ever seen. This is CBS News, Jackson, Mississippi.
One of the worst mosquito invasions ever is plaguing the Texas and Louisiana coasts this summer. Nearly millions of mosquitoes are making life especially miserable here in the South Louisiana bayou and swamp country, including New Orleans. A day like today, when the air is still,
But what was happening in the country at that time is that this, what we now call the civil rights movement, was beginning to explode.
May mean going to jail, but I'm going if it means that. It may even mean physical death, but if it means that I will die standing up for the freedom of my people.
Martin Luther King is among those who has vowed not to let the voter registration movement in Leesburg and the rest of South Georgia fail.
That God has given each and every one of us a rightful place in this world.
There was at the other extreme, the Ku Klux Klan, White Citizens Council, people determined to keep segregation as it was. And I was gape-mouthed and bug-eyed most of the time about what I was seeing. People would come seemingly out of the woodwork or out of the shrubbery and hit people with clubs, particularly cameramen were sometimes beaten. Place after place, we were spat upon by the worst elements of the community called the colored broadcasting system.
This is CBS News,
in Albany, Georgia.
I had no idea, although I'd grown up in a segregated society myself, of what it was really like to be black and to live in terror and in fear. It changed me dramatically as a person. In place after place after place, there was viciousness against women, children, churches. We reached the decisive moment when George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, said, "I will not allow the University of Alabama to be desegregated."
Tuesday, over there at Foster Auditorium, 2 Negroes will come to enroll.
George Wallace said, "I will stand in the schoolhouse door and stop you."
I stand here today as governor of this sovereign state and refuse to wittingly submit to illegal usurpation of power by the central government.
We were covering this live, but we couldn't have live camera coverage on the campus. This setup by which we put this on television is so Neanderthal by television standards now. Nelson Benton, a colleague, would be there. I would be just off campus on a telephone hookup with him. He would describe for me what was happening, and then I, live to New York, would relay his descriptions by telephone.
Governor Wallace is now walking away from the door, apparently capitulating now in his battle against the United States government to prevent 2 Negro students from entering the previously all-white University of Alabama.
And television has many weaknesses, but one of the strengths of television is it can put you there, where you could see for yourself, hear for yourself, and make a judgment for yourself what the reality was, and the reality was really ugly. And eventually, the country as a whole said, you know, we can't abide this, we can't stand this, and made changes.
Good afternoon, everybody. Just to let you know, I hope you're enjoying this sort of the Alamo Drafthouse experience where we have custom-made trailers for you before the main feature. We'll be getting going here a little before 5:30 because we have such a full house. We're going to start the program at about 5:25, and so in the meantime, I hope you'll enjoy more of these snapshots from Dan Rather's career, and we'll get on with the program quite soon. Thanks.
We know that everybody's going to be competitive on the do we or do we not summit. If everybody doesn't lead with it, most people will. How do we make ours better than either one of the other two?
There is competitiveness in the heart of every newsman, but the daily preparation of a 22-minute broadcast called the CBS Evening News is a study in cooperation. It is an intense collaborative effort.
You want to do a big Pine 3 graphic?
We have a nice one.
We're showing Honduras and Nicaragua.
What you see each night as you watch the evening news is the culmination of this process going on throughout the country and around the world. 24 hours a day. All those people, 1,500 people working for CBS News are putting on this program tonight. That's the reality of it. You walk around here And I know this looks chaotic, but there is an order, believe it or not, that flows through all of this. Unlike our friends in the entertainment division, we're not in the business of taking months and indeed sometimes years to construct a vision of reality. We're dealing in the reality business, which imposes its own particular deadlines.
What does he add to you? Hang on a second, man.
Today, the people in this modest studio will somehow organize and present information gathered in Moscow, Santa Barbara, Honduras, Atlanta, Stockholm, Johannesburg, and one story just a few blocks away in New York.
Bad flies in Miami.
Okay. Have you seen Touchdown?
I've not seen it. I've read the script.
This is the message the Sandinistas are viewing across the border.
A story taped in Honduras, edited in Dallas, fed to New York by satellite. The editorial staff reviews everything at least once. If there is a mistake or something is inaccurate, this is where the phone will ring.
By the Dutch News, CBS News with the Texas National Guard in Honduras.
Is it the first ever?
It turns out the first time for training, right? Not the first time for training.
Oh, yeah, you can ask Leslie 2 questions, probably? 3. An open question, 1 interior question, and a closed question. Okay. The total thing is 130. Okay. If it runs any more than that, it's para-carry time. Okay. Okay. Okay.
You see, each night there is the same awful challenge. It varies only in its difficulty. And that is to somehow squeeze the major news of the day into 22 minutes. Distilling, rewriting, juggling, trying to clarify, making every second count.
Dan asks her the first question, but that is not on the minute-and-a-half clock. Dan's first question is on our clock back here. Your clock starts running as soon as Leslie answers the first question. And I want that there's 3 questions and 3 answers, by golly.
I would love to try to kill a lot of copies and get textiles, which I think will work.
Have you seen it?
It's about to come in. I believe that's going to be good stuff.
John Mosley, is this true? Textiles are bigger than automobiles, steel, and petroleum refining? Don't believe it.
All right, I'm sorry, I do have it.
Please. I'm going to mark this as 20, but I'm going to ask John Mosley or somebody, let's get some research on it. Please check this out. Textiles are a bigger share of gross national product than automobiles, steel, and petroleum refining.
More Americans get their news from here than from any other source. For those who work here, it's a matter of pride and a profound burden of responsibility.
Okay, you know what would make me feel better? Right. Because let's get Toby or one of her people to quadruple checking. It's not that I doubt McManus, but, you know, trust your mother to check it out.
5 minutes.
Okay, we have speed.
For more than a century, this has been the reassuring thunder of the nation's textile mill.
5 minutes before airtime, a story shot in Avondale, South Carolina, comes in from the Atlanta Bureau.
Run backwards. They changed the copy.
Cuts have to be made to accommodate other stories still developing. The editorial process continues right up to airtime and even during the broadcast.
Okay, I know what we're going to do. Stop for a second here. Now, we're going to take
this. Hi, I'm Jay Bernhardt. I'm Dean of the Moody College of Communication. It's my real pleasure to welcome you all to the auditorium here in the Below Center for New Media. And for those of you who are watching this upstairs in our building, in our overflow rooms, welcome to all of you. And for people who may be watching this through live stream or later and web stream, welcome to all of you as well. On behalf of the Moody College of Communication, we're delighted that you could join us for this very special night. For those of you only in this room, I do want to remind you to please silence your phone if you have not done so already. It's our distinct pleasure and honor to serve as the co-host for tonight's event with the Briscoe Center for American History, as we honor and hear from one of the most iconic voices in American journalism, Dan Rather. Many of you may not be aware that Dan Rather, although he's not a graduate of UT, has been a champion and supporter of the Moody College of Communication for many years. He's a lifetime member of our Alumni and Friend Advisory Council, the body that helps provide strategic advice and guidance and direction for our college. In 2013, he was an integral part of the effort to obtain the landmark $50 million naming gift from the Moody Foundation of Galveston,
by sharing with the Moodys and others his profound respect for and support for our college. He's been a tireless advocate on our behalf and by helping us prepare our students for future careers in journalism and communication. And so before we proceed any further in tonight's event, I'd like to take a moment right now to personally and on behalf of our college to recognize and thank Dan Rather for his extraordinary contributions to Moody College. Please join me in giving him a hand. As you'll hear in a few minutes, tonight we're here to celebrate the launch of an exciting new project, Dan Rather, American Journalist, a website developed by the Briscoe Center for American History. And in just a few moments, I'll introduce the director of that center, Don Carlton, who will formally introduce Dan and our program and our panelists. But first, I want to just take a few moments to say a few words to speak to Dan's journalistic legacy, especially for some of the students who are here today or who are watching in the overflow rooms and online, because believe it or not, some of them may be too young to have seen many of your thousands of live television broadcasts. From his early days working for his college newspaper to his storied career on CBS television, and now through the power of new media, through social media in his interviews and stories and cable, Dan has embodied the drive and dedication that we in Moody College seek to instill in our students, regardless of the platform for distribution of their stories or the size of the screen on which it's going to be watched. During the last few years, Dan has become a virtual tour de force to be reckoned with on social media, amassing more than 2.4 million followers on Facebook, for example. And although we're not really counting, I believe that's several million more than all of today's current anchors. To introduce Dan Rather tonight is my friend and colleague, Dr. Don Carlton, Executive Director of UT Austin's Briscoe Center for American History and the J.R. Parton Chair in the Archives of American History. Under Don's leadership, the Briscoe Center has become one of the nation's leading history research centers. Don's the author of 9 books, including Red Scare and Conversations with Cronkite, among others. He's the executive producer of 2 PBS documentaries, When I Rise and Cactus Jack, Lone Star and Capitol Hill, and he's the editor of Focus on American History series, which is part of UT Press. Over the last 2 years, he's presided over a multi-million-dollar renovation to the Briscoe Center so that it can now better serve our students and faculty and other scholars from around the world. So with that, again, delighted to have you with us, and it's my pleasure to introduce and welcome to the stage Dr. Don Carlton to kick off tonight's program. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. Thank you so much, Jay, for that introduction. I just want you to know how pleased that we are that the Briscoe Center and the Moody College have joined together to host this program today, and welcome to all of you for joining with us to celebrate the launch of the Briscoe Center's new digital humanities project, Dan Rather, American Journalist. This 3-year project was led by Dr. Christelle Lefaucheux, who will come up in a few minutes to demonstrate the site for all of you. But I first want to say a few words about the university's Briscoe Center and its collections and mission. As one of the nation's leading history research centers, we collect, preserve, and make available documentary and material culture evidence encompassing key themes in Texas and U.S. history. Those key areas include the history of the American energy industry with the ExxonMobil Historical Archive, which is the most notable collection in that area, the history of the American South, which includes one of the most significant collections in existence documenting slavery and the antebellum cotton economy in this country, the history of American politics and the U.S. Congress, which features the papers of more than 60 former members of Congress, and U.S. news media history. Now, the center's efforts in the field of news media history have resulted in our building one of the nation's most extensive archives documenting the history of both print and broadcast news, and it includes a major collection of the personal archives of more than 40 leading photojournalists and documentary photographers. with a total of approximately 8 million photographic images, and still counting. The list of the distinguished journalists and photographers whose papers are at the center is a lengthy one. So for more information, I want to refer you, hopefully that you have the program here. We have a good list of some of the folks whose papers we have at the center. And for more information, you can just simply go to our website, which is briscoecenter.org. Go there and you can get more information about our program. Now, our researchers, students, and the general public make use of our collections for a wide range of academic, professional, and personal use. We don't just let the collections that we have sit idly on the shelves, gathering dust. We make them available to people like all of you. So please come to our newly renovated facility in Unit 2 of Sid Richardson Hall, where you can gain access to a whole world of historical treasures in American history. Now, these collections also inspire our own projects, including books such as our most recent book, which is about the career of Pulitzer Prize-winning photojournalist Eddie Adams, whose archive is at the center. That book is titled Eddie Adams, Bigger Than the Frame. And we co-published that book with the University of Texas Press, and it will be one of the books featured at the Texas Book Festival on November the 5th. It'll be the session that we will have for the Eddie Adams book. We also produce documentary films, special programs, and exhibits that are now on display in our brand new 4,000 square foot exhibition gallery in Sid Richardson Hall. Our next exhibit will show a sample of the center's extensive collection of iconic photographs documenting the civil rights and black power movements in this country, taken by photographers such as Flip Schulke, Charles Moore, and Spider Martin, whose archives are all at the Center for American History, the Briscoe Center. We're going to open that show on November the 9th, and I hope all of you can come and attend. And finally, the Center produces digital humanities projects such as Dan Rather, American Journalist. Now, the issues our panelists will discuss and that Dan Rather will discuss later tonight are the same as those that are at the core of Dan Rather, American Journalist. For example, how to produce broadcasts from war-torn countries, how to land and conduct interviews with world leaders, and best practices for covering epoch shattering events such as 9/11. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Christelle Lefaucheux, a native of France. Christelle has earned advanced degrees in history from the University of Cologne in Germany and from our history department right here at the University of Texas. As manager of the Rather Project, Christelle worked personally with individuals from across the news media profession who have donated nearly 100 linear feet of archival material to the center, greatly enhancing our research holdings in news media history. Before you come up, Christelle, I really want to convey my sincere thanks to all of the center staff, current and former, who worked with you and contributed so much to the project. Thank you so much, guys. I appreciate your work very much. Christelle?
Thank you, Don. Please, please, please. Oh, gosh. This is the moment where you can't remember your password. Yeah. All right. We're not there yet. All right. Thank you, Don, for the kind introduction and the Texas pronunciation of my name. I appreciate. My goal in the next 10 minutes is to give you a quick little bit of background about the project before guiding you through the site itself with a few examples of the rich and diverse materials we collected and curated on the site. These range from production memos to original footage, from interviews to photographs. But first, I would like to take a moment to thank everyone that helped with the creation of the site, from the dozen of archives and libraries across the country who generously worked with us, especially the Howard Gottlieb archival research at the Boston University, to pretty much every staff member at the Briscoe Center, and I see a few here. I would like to single out the Rather team, we were known, which helped turn the idea, the vision I had for the site into reality. Our 3 interns, Tal Tatum Harper, Scott Jordan, and Brent Van Unen. Our in-house editor, Holly Taylor. Holly, are you here? And especially our webmaster and digital content experts, Paul Wenzel and David Zepeda, responsible for the look, the feel, and the functionality of the site. The site owes much to their creativity, ingenuity, and their patience working with me. So the Dan Rather Legacy Project, charged with the creation of the website that would best document the career of Dan Rather, we started with some good old-fashioned research. We looked at available materials in the archive and made a tentative list of all the stories he had done. Needless to say, we were quickly completely overwhelmed, not just by the amount of stories, but even more so by the variety of his work. We realized that a chronological structure would not do justice and decided instead for a thematic organization of the site that you can see here, hidden behind the plant. So let me take you on the tour. And maybe the first section of the site is here at the bottom right, but oops, there we go. Consists of a biography, a list of awards, a section on his thoughts about journalism, as well as his work with the Committee to Protect Journalists, and some of the controversies he was involved with. The main body of the site really are those 5 sections here on the top, from his work as an investigative journalism, his passion for being in the midst of stories, his work as a political analyst, and as a skillful interviewer, as well, of course, as his tenure as the anchor of CBS News for 24 years, the longest tenure in the history of broadcast news. As you can see, each of the sections is divided into subsections that you can access that way. Here you have a short essay about the news program themselves, from some CBS report to 60 Minutes to Dan Rather report from 2006 on. At the level story, here we have, for example, the 1976 piece, Where Are They Now?, with interviews with the individuals that were involved in the 1963 integration of the University of Alabama. And a set of curated archival items here on the left. Depending on the archives we have everything from the original footage, in this case from 1976. We have interviews with producers, Marion Golden. We have images, here pictures of Vivian Malone and James Hood, the 2 students that integrated the university, as well as Governor Wallace and Deputy U.S. Attorney Nicholas Katzenbach. We have the entire transcript of the show, of the 60 Minutes. And I think very important, especially for future journalists, we have, for example, the notebook of the producer here, during the shooting, for example, in Atlanta. So you can really follow the making of the story. If we move to the underground section, we divide the section into crises and conflicts, from civil rights movement and the Vietnam War all the way to the war in Iraq. Foreign affairs, when Dan Rather, over the course of his career, really tried to bring international events into the household, the living room of Americans. And his passion, natural disasters, starting with Hurricane Carla in 1961, which really launched his career at CBS. And you saw a little clip earlier, which, by the way, was the first time in television that the radar image was put on the screen. The underground section is designed a little differently. You have a grid here, so you get a better, quick overview of the different stories proposed. If you click on one, you see it's activated on the Gulf War. You're redirected to a video on the left-hand side and a quick summary on the right-hand, your right, anyway, on one side. The summaries are the summaries of the event, but really our focus was on how television, and specifically CBS and Dan Rather, covered those events. Here the documents can be accessed through a drop-down menu. We have everything from videos to photographs. Over 200 of these photographs, by the way, are from the Briscoe collection. Here, President Bush with soldiers. What I found really interesting was we also have materials about the nitty-gritty, the working of a big network like CBS. How do I put a broadcast together when I'm hundreds of miles away from New York? It starts with asking the military, can we come and follow the troops and film them? All the way to, for example, a memo here about a possibility of chemical war, chemical attacks. You know, what should the correspondent and the staff do when they're in the field? The political analyst section focuses on Rather's work as a White House correspondent under Johnson and Nixon, and of course his work during the Watergate scandal. The bulk is about his election coverage. And yes, everybody's counting. Those are 14 presidential elections. We actually started in '64 when he was working with CBS, but he can tell you he actually covered presidential election before. 56, I will say, was the first one, presidential election. So each of those elections, there's a quick summary, there's a focus at the bottom on television coverage. How was the evolution? How did television cover the election? And then we have materials about primaries, about convention, about debates. Some of you might be surprised that there was a couple years when there was no debates. Interesting story behind that. And of course, the election night itself. We have everything from videos, pictures. We have sometimes, again, we're really dependent on what's in the archive. The transcript of the election night, as you can see, it was from 7 p.m. to 2:44 a.m. that night. Sometimes, like in 2000, it was a little longer. All the way to advertisement. CBS was so proud in 1980 because they won, the election team won the ratings war. So there was an ad put in the paper. CBS team won. America's choice. Interviewer was really tricky. Dan probably did, I don't know, hundreds of interviews. We divide them between political and civic leaders, everything from civil rights activist and then US Ambassador Andrew Young, all the way to former Pakistani Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto. We have cultural figures, classical conductor, basketball coach, musical icon Willie Nelson, and of course the presidents. Or some of those were presidential hopefuls when he interviews them. Again, it's a system of grids. You click, you have a couple of images, and materials are accessible here. So depending on the archive, we have videos, photographs, transcript, but I think again, especially here, I think we have a room full of journalist students. What's really interesting is to see the preparation behind such big interviews. What is a man, the journalist, that they never do? Well, one of the things he did is that asking fellow journalists for questions. And we find sometimes 60, 70 questions, and then marks, no, not this one, put this one first. Let's ask him that first. Start with the soft question. Start with a compliment. I like the color of your tie. And then we can move on. And the last section is anchorman. I just mentioned 24 years as the anchorman. We start talking about the early anchor. The first broadcast for CBS Evening News was in 1948 with Douglas Edward. Of course, then was Walter Cronkite. And then from 1981 to 2005. We asked, what is the managing editor, which was the title that Dan had. We have two short sections where we trace the evolution of the evening news as well as the role of the anchor. Not anchor are created equal. Not all anchors are created equal. And we have a section on breaking news, when Dan Rather was the anchor, from the Reagan assassination attempt all the way to the Challenger disaster, and of course September 11. And I think, I assume some of the panelists will talk about that. Dan is often, there's a lot of admiration for his work in moments of crisis, when there's millions of information, 2 earpiece, notes from above everywhere. He stays calm and steady and is able to do that. And it's a really, really difficult task, and he's very good at it. And finally, the site is designed to be useful for teachers and students. So now that it's live, this is the launch, we'll work in a couple months with teachers and educators and students across the country and add some templates and suggestions for lesson plans and activities. If you have any suggestions, please email me. Needless to say, I just barely scratched the surface of the site. This is really like a very, very quick overview. I just want to finish by saying that at the core of the site really is one man, and this man is Dan Rather. I've been worked on the site for 3 years. A little tip if you're interested in getting a little closer and getting to know him better, I will recommend that you look at his writing. The radio columns he wrote, the weekly newspaper columns between 19 and 2006. You will get a sense of his humanity, how he cares about people and his country, of his sense of humor. He's actually really funny. And of his passion for journalism. Of course, recently his Facebook post, I think, also give you a good sense of that. Throughout the site, and even more in his writing, you will find a man who strived throughout his career to be, as he called it, a reporter with a capital R. Thank you. I need to say something. I would like now to invite the members of a panel discussion to come to the stage. The discussion will be moderated by Paul Steckler, a nationally recognized writer and documentary filmmaker, whose films about American politics have won every major award in television documentary. At UT since 1997, Paul is a professor in the UT's Department of Radio, Television, Film, and was the department chairman between 2010 and 2017. Among his many accomplishments, he has helped transform the RTF department into one of the top programs of the country. Please welcome Paul Steckler. And the panelists.
I don't. It's my honor to be here today because I'm a great admirer and fan of Dan Rather. I'm old enough to have been in a family back in the old days of media, broadcast journalism, when all there was CBS, NBC, and barely ABC, that I think only had a 15-minute broadcast. And our family was a CBS family. We used to have dinner, and we ate dinner on something called TV stack tables, gathered around our little black and white TV set, and we'd watch Walter Cronkite and Dan Rather. And I remember Dan sparring with President Nixon. It goes back that far. And so it's a delight to be here tonight. I had lunch with these three guys today, and they are fabulous. Let me introduce them, and then we'll have a little discussion about what it was like to work with Dan and how the news media and broadcast media has changed over time. On my far section over here, currently the Vice President of Programming at CNN, Jim Murphy was the executive producer of the CBS Evening News with Dan Rather for 5 years, during which he worked on the coverage of 9/11, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and the second Saddam Hussein interview. And he's also very proud today that he was mentioned, CNN was mentioned in a tweet by our president, equating NBC News with CNN. Congratulations. I hope your license continues. In the middle here, we have an investigative reporter who broke the Abu Ghraib story. Dana Robertson is a Peabody Award winner who worked on the acclaimed CBS programs 60 Minutes and Sunday Morning with the late Charles Kuralt. In 2006, she joined Dan Rather on his investigative team at HDNet. She's currently a producer on the wonderful New York Public Radio series, The Takeaway. And finally, a man who grew up one town from me in northern New Jersey, a CBS special events producer. John Reed is a 4-time Emmy Award winner who covered major events around the world, including Tiananmen Square, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and conflicts in Somalia and Iraq. He also worked on live news specials during every election since 1972. So please welcome John. You know, like the wonderful website that covers the length and breadth of Dan's career, these folks cover the length and breadth of Dan's career as well, and that Dan was an anchor of the national news for CBS. Dan was a reporter on the ground. And by the way, for those of you that were here early enough, there was amazing footage in the site of Dan reporting from Vietnam and dropping his microphone to help carry a wounded soldier off the battlefield. And Dan was also the head of an investigative team, of which all three of these people here were involved. And so what we were talking about at lunch were just their best stories, the best ones, about working with Dan. And in that way also telling us what it was like to work in the different areas of the broadcast media. So Jim, why don't we start with you? Tell us a little bit about, and you told me that I should remind you about your best war story.
Which I've never told in public before. It was great. The time I got to the evening news was actually a rather bizarre time in American sort of news and cultural history. I came there at the end of '99 and became the executive producer at the start of the year 2000. And until September 11th happened, it was a pretty bizarre world. That was the summer of 2001, before the attack happened, was the summer of the shark attack, which was bizarre for newscasts to be going crazy over, certain events like that. And the summer of the Chandra Levy case, which itself is a story and a controversy that Dan and I were deeply involved with that summer. But once September 11th happened and the world changed, we spent a lot of time on the road over the next several years, because first there was Afghanistan, and we went and covered the war there. Dan was the first American anchor to get into the country, which another story that's unbelievable, just getting there, because it was very difficult. The Intifada, the second Intifada in Israel and the West Bank. In 2002, we spent about 2.5 weeks there and made a lot of news with a lot of different interviews. And then the Iraq War and getting the final interview with Saddam a couple of weeks before the war started. And the funny story I'm going to tell about that day, we had been into Iraq, I guess that was our third trip in when the interview finally happened. And we'd been going over and doing the broadcast from Kuwait and watching the military build up and stuff, and then going into Baghdad for a couple of days and trying to angle our way toward the interview. And we had no idea that it was actually going to happen the day it did happen. We had been working a bunch of different angles trying to get to Saddam. And finally, a guy in a uniform shows up at our hotel and goes, get in the car. And they put us in the back of a Mercedes with black curtains around the back seat so they could drive us around and, I guess in their minds, take us all over the place. We wouldn't know where we were going. And they took us to this weird, very nice little house, which was apparently on a military base because there were walls all around it and a lot of tough-looking guys. And they put us in this nice little house in the living room by ourselves with a valet in a tuxedo who kept bringing us round after round in the typical Arab hospitality way of coffee, orange juice, egg clairs, chocolates, coffee, orange juice, tea. And we were there for hours waiting, wondering if this was going to happen. And at one point, since we had been through similar things before, at one point I remember the two of us being forced by Hezbollah to get into the back of a blacked out car in a blacked out garage to get taken to one of the Hezbollah leaders for an interview. You never know what exactly is going on with these guys and if this may be your, last day of freedom. And if you remember, in the '91 Gulf War, Saddam had kept people as guests, any foreigner who was left in the country, and they were put in critical locations so that the Americans wouldn't bomb them. So I was wondering if we were going to wind up as, potential hostages and not get the interview. And we were whispering to each other about these things whenever the butler wasn't in the room, and we were waiting forever. All you had were two guys in leather coats and weapons standing over by the door who couldn't hear us. And finally people showed up, so we knew something was going on. But at one point, Dan leaned over to me and he said to me, and he's been everywhere. It was only my second or third time in a potential war zone, and he'd been to 100. And he said to me, Murph, if anything goes wrong here, anything goes wrong, I'm going through that kitchen door over there. I'm bolting that way. You pull your blazer over your head, go head first through that window. I was like, why do I have to go through the window?
That's very thoughtful. Yeah, putting the pit over so the
yes,
glass
it was
one
nice
hit
you told me how to protect my scalp, yes.
Okay, Dana, working with Dan.
Well, boy, some of my favorite stories are, my first wartime experience was with Dan, also in Afghanistan, but I won't go into the war stories so much. I'll pivot a little bit and talk about some of my favorite stories with him, just sort of here in this country. Dan often would come into my office. We would have long conversations about race relations in this country, just sort of bouncing ideas off of each other, and sort of as things sort of happened over time, talking about what's going on, what needs to change, and sort of conversations like that. Those are some of my favorite personal stories with him. One of my personal favorite actual news stories was we had found out after Strom Thurmond died that he had a black daughter. Mm-hmm. That he, Strom Thurmond from the South, racist, come to find out he had an affair with one of his people that worked in the house, and he had this biracial daughter named Essie Mae. And long before one person had tried to get an interview with her and couldn't. And after he died, I was having conversations with friends, and they said, boy, I wonder if his daughter is still alive. And I was like, what? Let's find out. Lo and behold, she was. We tracked her down in Los Angeles, doggedly pursued that poor woman. I felt bad for her in the end, but got the interview. In the end, part of it was Dan sort of talking about appealing to her sense of history, and what she could represent, and sort of by hiding her story, she was denying generations the opportunity to sort of hear what she had to say. And so we tracked her down. We finally convinced her to do this story. And sort of, as things happen in news, we were scheduled to fly out to Los Angeles. We may have even been at the airport that morning in the lounge, and Saddam Hussein was captured. Or was he killed? I can't remember. I think he was captured.
No, he was hanged.
He was hanged? Was that it?
So he was captured. That was the day he was captured.
And of course, you can't fly to Los Angeles to do, a profile on, this story that I've been working so long on. And Dan, with his ability to pivot, said, well, let's bring her here. And he went to the anchor desk, and he did the sort of nonstop coverage of Saddam Hussein. And then when she got, to New York, he completely shifted gears and put on his compassion hat and really sort of the person that he is, and really got her to open up and tell her story. And so that is sort of one of my best memories of working with him.
John?
Well, these guys worked with Dan on regularly scheduled broadcast evening news every day, 60 Minutes 2, other projects that are thoughtful, and you have to get things done over time. Evening news, you got to get things done every day, and it's juggling all kinds of things. I work for the Special Events Unit, which is the unit that interrupted the network, either with planned events like election night or convention coverage or presidential debates, but whatever the hot news story was going to be. And I think it was Christelle mentioned that Dan liked to go to the story, and that is absolutely correct. That's what I will always remember about Dan, is that he will go to the story. At special events, I'd go like, where are we going now? Because you see something has happened. There's a famine in Somalia, for example. Well, we're going to Somalia. There are no flights into Somalia. It is a totally collapsed state. There are rival gangs all over with teenaged young men driving around in pickup trucks with 50 caliber machine guns, AKs, all that sort of stuff. And they're teenagers. That's the biggest worry, is they're teenagers. Sorry, guys. And
they might be just a little unstable.
They're energetic.
Right.
But there are no flights in, and we made our way, and I have to put this man on the air. I've got to get a satellite dish. I've got to get camera crews ready. These guys are the thought folks. I'm the get him on the air guy. Mm-hmm. And we get to Nairobi, and the only flights in are little single propeller planes, like Piper Cup kind of things. And Larry Doyle and I and Dan huddle and say, what do you think? And we all come up with the same thing. We knew what Dan's going to say is, why are we here? We can't report on Somalia from Nairobi, so we have to go in there. So we had to work out a way of feeding people into the airport in Somalia with the pilot saying, well, if there's any gunfire, I'm going to turn around.
In a Piper Cub from Nairobi?
Yes.
That's a long flight in a Piper Cub.
Yeah. Well, actually, the longest part of the flight was the approach. Because you don't know if anybody's going to say, hey, what's that up there? Take a pot shot. But I have to get some of the gear in, the camera crews. I have to have some elements of the uplink, because it's no good to have the CBS Evening News anchor in a place where I got to tell New York, well, I can't put him on the air. But he's here. So he agreed. We just started a force feed and rotating the flights in and out, and getting rides from the UN forces, which were those poor Pakistani troops that were just hunkered down all the time. And we had to make it up from scratch. There had been a Mary Mapes-like producer already there. And it was the young guy from the London Bureau who became bureau chief.
Andy Clark.
Andy Clark had already been there, and he had set up in a house. And so I said, okay, we're going there. And he goes, well, not a whole lot of people. I said, no, everybody's coming. There ended up with about 30 of us sleeping on the floors. Dan was up in a bedroom with 2 other people, including one of Kathy Sherry, one of our hard news producers. And Dan was just, okay, when can I get on the air? And we had to get on the air, because he's the hardest working man I've ever met in a very hard working industry. And that's it. He's energetic. It's, I have to go where the story is. And then he will talk to folks everywhere. And we were there ahead of the Marines. We were ahead of the Army. There were nobody, the only people with weapons were the locals, who were all in different gangs or tribes, and who didn't like each other. And he went everywhere. He's amazing.
Jim, what makes a good anchor? And I looked over the things that happened during your tenure at the Evening News, and I was struck by the fact that you were covering 9/11. So can you combine those two about what it was like to be in New York covering 9/11 and what makes a good anchor, and why is Dan a great anchor?
Well, there's a multitude of talents and skills that the best anchors have. And they range from your level of curiosity and interest and engagement, which is really important. There are some anchors who are purely performers and know little about what they're covering or discussing. And then there are people who actually really care, and Dan is one of those. On top of that, being handsome helps. You had that, check the box. Having a great voice helps. I mean, those are physical characteristics, and then the intangibles are how much passion you have, and just how good you are at it. I can remember so many incidents. One morning in Israel, he was supposed to be on the morning program for CBS, so it was mid-afternoon there, and we were there with Mary Mapes from 60 Minutes. She was out shooting with him. I was getting more and more furious because they weren't back on time, and a lot of stuff had been happening overnight and into the morning. And I literally had so many notes about things we were going to have to discuss, the whole page. And they come running in the door about 2 minutes to air, and he's on about 1 minute into the program. And I just started letting him have it. At this point, I'd been working with him for about 2 years, so I could be brutally honest. And I was just like, this happened, this happened. I was freaking out, and I was just really annoyed at how late they were, and I tried to unload 5 minutes of information into his head in about 42 seconds. And then they go like, Dan, and he's on the air. And he literally, even though I had probably raised his blood pressure 20 points, looks into that camera and delivers a perfectly fluid, completely fact-filled, all correct, 3.5 minute live report. And I was standing there behind the cameraman just in complete awe, because I could not imagine anybody having the ability to do that. And that was the time I learned just how great the greatest ones can be. You know, 9/11 coverage, I don't think Dan was off the air for more than 30 or 40 seconds a day for bathroom breaks for 4 or 5 straight days. We producers had the small luxury of producing several hours of each day's coverage, but he was our only anchorman, and he had to be at the helm the entire time. That was, I don't know how anyone could do it. I could certainly not do it. Most people couldn't do it. And I know there were several great anchormen in modern American history who did it, but it's really hard. And that story was really hard to keep your cool about and get through it day by day. One of the things I loved about working with Dan on breaking news coverage was just how exacting he was in trying to make sure that people knew exactly what was going on. He was constantly fact-checking, constantly underlining, or as he liked to say on the air often, underscore, this is not known yet, just so the story was always straight, the work was always correct, because that's really vital in times like that. And I mean, when you look at the world we live in now, where Las Vegas happens, and within 10 or 15 minutes, InfoWars has a conspiracy theory up, and people are trading it on social media, it's so critical for people to seek out sources that get things right and fact check well, and Dan was just a master at that.
I'm going to want to get to, after we're done with this section, about just how the media has changed, and that's obviously one of the ways it's changed. John was trying to get my attention, so.
Yeah, I wanted to second that ability of Dan's to process, take in information and process it in a very short amount of time, and spit it out coherently and logically. I would also add the other thing that he has is a sense of context. He has put in the time, both in reading and every person he's ever interviewed, whether it's a politician or whether it's a woman who lost her home in a flood or a family that lost their home in an earthquake. It doesn't matter to him, big, small, but his brain, he remembers that. He remembers what it is like to be a human being. He remembers what a politician said 10 years ago that is now saying something different. It's there, and that is added to anytime one of us would brief him, okay, here's the latest we have on this story, and you've got to spit it out in about 30 seconds, and he can add that context as well. And I'd add 2 other things. He had an interior clock. You could tell him, we need 1:31. We need 47 seconds. We need 2.5 minutes. Boom. And he wraps up at the end of whatever the time is. And the other quality that he needed, and it was shown on the Endless Election Night in 2000 when I was down in the pit, we went on the air pretty much at 5:30 in the afternoon and got off at 9 a.m. the next day. Dan took 1 pee break. We had Bob Schieffer shift into the chair while Dan was away, just in case we had to continue. And Dan came back. Schieffer had to move back over his seat.
I hope the students out there are paying attention to the qualities that you need.
Well, it's true. You need that ability to continue to work, to concentrate, to focus, and to use what you've learned.
Dana, you broke one of the most important stories, and again, for the students out here, this is a real textbook, case of investigative journalism on Abu Ghraib. Can you talk about that, about breaking the story, and then how the investigative team worked with it?
Sure. So Abu Ghraib came from, it actually was a source that I had from a previous story that we had done. So for all of you aspiring journalists, keep in touch with all your sources. Just when a story is over doesn't mean that the story's over. And I had been friends with this gentleman and just checked in with him occasionally. He was in the military, pretty high up, working with a lot of people in Central Command.
Do all the kids know what Abu Ghraib is?
Do you guys know what Abu Ghraib is?
That's actually a good point.
Abu Ghraib was a notorious prison in Iraq under Saddam Hussein where they tortured prisoners. And it was in control by the US military. A bunch of military police were sort of overseeing, and they were guarding. They were military guards that were in charge of this prison. And this particular military person called me one day. We had just come back from doing a story about a serial killer in Seattle, and I was sitting at my desk, and we were wrapping up editing on that, and the phone rings. It's a phone call from Iraq, and it's this my contact, and he says, "I have the mother of all stories for you." That's literally what he said. And when you have a contact for a very long time, when someone calls you up with that message, you take them very seriously. Because we had worked before, we had a good reputation together, we had done some great stories together, I could always trust him. And that's how it started. And I said, "Okay, what's going on?" And he said, "Well, there's rumors." Well, it wasn't rumors. There's an investigation into U.S. military personnel who were softening up prisoners, basically trying to get them to talk and making them do things that were humiliating. And there were photos of this taking place. And I said, "Do you have the photos?" And he says, "No." I said, "Can you describe the photos?" So he describes the photos in very, very clear detail. And then sort of gave me the information he could, which was essentially one name from a unit. It ended up being the person who had the photographs. He had come back from being in Iraq. He was in Pennsylvania. He contacted his friends, and he said, "I don't have any photographs. Can you send me some?" They sent him a disc, and on the disc are some of these photographs. Not what he was expecting, obviously, so he went to his higher-ups and reported it, and that's when the whole investigation started. So we backtracked a little bit. He had told me that if you go back and you look in the summer, they would do, Central Command would do these press conferences where they would sort of run down what had happened during the day or during the week, and they had sort of brushed by really quickly, and there's an investigation going into abuses at Abu Ghraib prison. And that's all they said, and they didn't say by who, but we had sort of some time stamps that kind of helped us work through it, and then it just became the mad sort of phone calling, using Lexis at the time. We didn't have Google or the internet in the way we have it now. And literally using Nexus, tracking down this guy's number, tracking down his neighbors' numbers, calling the neighbors, trying to find out if they knew who this guy was and where he was, and eventually got through to his wife, who had admitted that the military came and basically confiscated all their hard drives and everything. And then through them and finding out his contact with another unit, we got the name of some of the soldiers in Abu Ghraib who were responsible, and we tracked down the lawyer for one of the other soldiers who was being charged, and basically convinced them that to give a sort of exculpatory interview, which basically meant, their sort of defense was that they had been asked by higher-ups to do this. And so our way of getting him to give us the interview was, well, if this is the case, we need to get this out there. Maybe it will save you jail time. That was sort of the start of how we got the interview, which Dan did over the phone with this gentleman. Chip Frederick was his name. And then it just sort of came down to begging and scrounging and doing all sorts of things. I flew to Kuwait trying to track down these photographs. And one day they just sort of showed up on my computer, emailed and not edited or anything. There were about 15 of them. They were horrifying. We had all sort of heard what they looked like. We had not really seen it, and when you see it up close and you have it, then it turns into the really tough part of, now we have to get this on the air, which became another challenge. But it eventually was on the air. We had to get verification of the photographs and make sure they were actually legitimate and not doctored. We probably got 3 or 4 sources on that. And after some going back and forth with the military, who were asking us not to air the photographs because they were concerned for lives overseas, we went ahead and aired the broadcast.
I want to shift the conversation. And by the way, there's going to be a few minutes for question and answer. So if you have questions, you might want to line up a few people at least over at the microphones over here. The shift that I want to do is especially for students here. I've been watching as much as I can the Vietnam series on PBS. It's only 18 hours long, and I think I've gotten through 7 parts so far. But quite frankly, as somebody who grew up on the journalism of the Vietnam War, reading Neil Sheehan's book eventually, David Halberstam's book. For those of you who've never read Michael Hare, the late Michael Hare's book, Dispatch, is the best book ever written about war, except for perhaps our local Tim O'Brien's book, The Things They Carried, who's also in the series. It's a pretty amazing series. But one of the things that's really astounding about it is watching the way the news media covered Vietnam. There's Morley Safer, who was the CBS's reporter in Vietnam right before Dan, under fire, with a platoon, talking about analyzing the war in Vietnam. Or Walter Cronkite, essentially going on the evening news and declaring the war a failure. The news was really different back then. Now, again, it was 3 networks. I'm sure that all of you, when you went into journalism, had an idea of how it worked, what it was like, and obviously it's changed quite a bit. So can you talk a little bit about just how the business, how you saw it, how you got into it, and how the business has changed over time, especially for our young journalism students that will be starting out in the next year or two?
Well, a little history goes well with that question. News divisions in the 1950s and 60s grew rapidly, did well, could spend a lot of money for a couple of reasons. One was there were only 3 television networks, and they basically had a monopoly on a giant marketplace, made shitloads of money, and were able to generously support strong news divisions. So that is one thing that has changed at some point toward the late 80s, all through the 80s, I guess, after cable was invented and then other commercial pressures. The competition got stiffer, the resources got scarcer, and news divisions became part of the commercial prospects of a company. Look, I work at CNN now. We make more money than any other division, I think, at Time Warner, or a larger percentage of profit than any other division at Time Warner. So we have a corporate owner that wants that money to keep rolling in, obviously, because it's a capitalist society and it's sort of hyper-capitalist at this point in time. But they still provide us with a real lot of resources, and CNN gets to do a real lot of things that, valuable pieces of journalism. There have definitely, since news divisions and news organizations on television became profit centers, there definitely has been more commercial pressure and business pressure on those divisions to think as much about the business and making money as about everything else they do. Yet, depending on where you're working, you can have very solid support and really excellent independence. I mean, I remember at CBS having a huge argument with some big shot in sales over some investigative work we were doing that he would rather not see, and it was like, sorry you're upset, but it's not going to go away. And my boss backed me up completely, which at the time I was frankly a little surprised by. I wasn't sure he was going to. And at CNN, I mean, Jeff Zucker is an incredibly independent and strong-willed person who is a really excellent journalist, and and Jeff Bucas, who's the current chair of Time Warner, who will be leaving after AT&T purchases Time Warner. That deal's closing in the next couple of months probably, is also a really big believer in the First Amendment and in the ability to create the content you want to create and cover the news the way you want to cover it. So I mean, I've been fairly fortunate in who I've worked for, but I know that people have suffered at times from corporate pressure and are probably steered away from some things at times. And at the same time, there's so much journalism now that it's pretty hard to keep things hidden.
Dana, you've made the transition to public radio.
I will say, I think one thing, and part of it is there's so much journalism now, and the money is sort of shifted to a different place. What's expected now of young journalists, where when I went to CBS, I knew I had a team around me. There was a cameraman and the producer and your anchor and your editor, and now you guys have to do it all. I mean, they're asking you to shoot, jump in front of the camera, anchor, take it back, tweet,
edit it on
your send, I mean, all in like a very short period of time and not for a lot of money. And that makes it really hard, I think, for young journalists now to sort of really have that hunger, but hunger is really what drives you. If you love telling stories, which I've always done, if you're a pretty solid writer, you have to have that lead in that nut graph, in almost everything, whether it's radio or television or print, you can do it. It's just, it really is sort of that being curious all the time and really that drive to get out there and try to tell stories. There's a lot of pressure now, I think, to pick one side or the other. I was there at a time where it was very normal to be objective, You know, everyone was expected to be objective. It was sort of, that was the norm. That's not the norm anymore. There's pressures to choose, you know, are you going to be liberal leaning? Are you going to go the Fox way? Are you going to go, you know, the way, you know, Alex Jones way? I think sort of trying to, I think trying to, you know, just sort of standing your ground and just sort of realizing that you're there to tell the story and to get both sides. And at the end of the day, it's about what's factual, and it's harder now to figure out what's factual. There's a lot of information coming at you, some of it real, some of it not so real, but that's part of your job too as a journalist, to really figure it out. And it's still a great, in my opinion, it's a great profession. I'm still in it. I've transitioned from television to radio. The difference mostly is just it's still reporting, it's still journalism. I listen more, I think, than I did before, just because I don't have the visuals to distract me as much. And I think about that when I'm producing stories, you know, that's what our audience wants to hear. But the nuts and bolts are still the same.
John, and you were all over the world, and you were there at Tenement Square, you know, when Dan was the only anchor there.
And well, and lots of other places. You know, I wasn't up in the bucket with him at the Berlin Wall. Dan was up in the bucket with the cameraman because we get the shot. But I've thought about this a lot because Dana said there's more journalism now, but there's not more resources. Nobody's got more resources. We had bureaus all over the country and all over the world. That meant you had people who could say, that's a bunch of baloney, or that guy's a liar. You know, we know him for that, or we know, you know, this is where the story should go. You had people on the ground. Now, journalists are expected to do it all by themselves. It's impossible. It's crazy. The other problem is I worked in the live television news end of it, and I see a lot of the sins of live television. I remember when I would be not in the field but working in the control room, and I remember it was some kid down a hole kind of story, and we broke into the network, you know. Johnny's down in a little cave or something like that. And the guy, I think we're getting close to him. You know, all that kind of stuff. And the country was enthralled. We're laughing, but
no, there's a wonderful Hollywood film whose name I can't remember. What's it called?
It's very much. It was very much. Isn't that Kirk Douglas? That's where he as a reporter makes his name. We had one correspondent on scene, Bruce Hall. And I'm dealing with the remotes and from the control room in New York. And, you know, Bruce, what's the latest? Well, I've been tied to this microphone and in front of the camera for the last 20 minutes talking to you guys in New York about what's the latest. And I don't know what the latest is because I'm standing here in front of the camera instead of doing my job as a reporter going to find out what's happening. And I said, that's a really good point, Bruce. Break and go and find out what's happening. Immediately, my boss has said, okay, is Bruce ready? And I said, no. And they said, get him ready. And I said, not going to happen right now. And they said, why? And I said, because I sent him off. And they said, what for? And I said, to find out the news. So when Dan asked him, what's the latest, he can tell Dan the latest. They were not happy with me, but I was old enough and experienced enough to withstand the pressure which you get in live television to always have somebody to go to, whether it's Charlottesville, whether it's Somalia, whether it's Northridge, wherever it's just out in front of this hall. And that's not reporting. After the initial report, it's dead. It's dead air. But the home base keeps hungering. I can't have my anchor continue to yammer. I got to be able to go somewhere else for variety and for new information, but we're preventing them from finding out the information. And we don't have the resources.
At the networks, you don't. I worked at 2 of the networks. It was at the 2 that I worked at, I lived through multiple rounds of cuts.
Right. Yes.
All the network news divisions shrink.
That's right.
CNN does not have a resource issue. I mean, we've got thousands of people.
I mean, I'm sorry, I know you work at CNN now, and CNN gets this great reputation from the first Gulf War, and at the time, I told the vice presidents at CBS, I would have told the other 2 networks guys the same thing, that they were a bunch of freaking idiots because the networks had set up each network provided 3 teams, pool teams, a correspondent, a camera crew, to go out with various American military groups or Arab groups. And so there were no Fox then, so there was 4 networks, so that's 12 teams. And I said to my bosses, well, you're going to put Joe Blow from ABC on CBS here? And he said, absolutely not. I said, you're going to put Jane Blow from CNN on the air? Absolutely not. ABC and NBC, the same thing. So they looked like they had the war covered because we set it up and gave them that stuff, but we wouldn't air any other network's correspondent because we're ABC, we're NBC. I took Dan into Kuwait City. We beat the Marines in there. We went through through Kuwait with all the flaming oil wells that the Iraqis had set on fire. It looked. I kept looking around for Rod Serling. I mean, for you younger folks, Rod Serling was a creator and host of The Twilight Zone, my favorite show when I was a kid. It was bizarre, and we beat the Marines in there. We beat everybody else in there, and we got him on the air live from Kuwait City. And I never saw anybody from CNN doing anything except coming up to me and saying, well, my people in Atlanta said that you have the only communication and we should make you cool. And I said, goodbye. And he said, well, we're going to complain to your bosses in New York. And I said, well, I'll tell my bosses in New York they can, until they come here and push me away and make me give you time on my satellite dish, you ain't getting here. And I know they ain't coming here.
For those of you in the audience that were not born then, there's a wonderfully strange experimental film by Werner Herzog, and all it is just the flames coming out of those burning oil wells, and it's pretty amazing looking. This is Dan's night, and I think we have less than 5 minutes to go. How about one last thought just about Dan? Jim, Dana, and then John.
Boy, that puts you on the spot.
That's what I'm here for.
One last thought about Dan. I mean, Dan's life and work are just the landscape of the United States for the last 70 years. I mean, from when he was a teenager, he was engaged in what was going on in this country. When he went to the network and got to travel and cover all the big stories of his time, civil rights movement, Vietnam, Watergate, the modern Mideast wars, presidential scandals, amazing elections. He's seen it all, and he was always there for it. And being there is an extremely important part of it. One of the reasons it was so great to travel with him is that there's nothing like going to a war zone or to a great story anywhere in the world that's even just an interesting story, because you really learn so much more than you do from sitting at home base and getting everything, handed to you. And I also think that so much of what people say about Dan, they'd understand him better if they would just look closely at what he covered and how he covered it, because the issues that shaped this country over the last 60, 70 years are what shaped him, and who he turned out to be, and how he's lived and how he's worked.
Dana?
Wow, I echo that 100%. I think Dan also just, knew sort of how to just sort of move away from it too. We worked some really long hours in the field, a lot of time, a lot of high pressure things happen. And then when the day is over, or sometimes it's early in the morning, just the ability to go, so, how's your mom? Or just sort of bring you back to reality and to things that are really important, and I think that's part of his legacy is, there is a humanness to people that you just see on TV. I think a lot of times they're painted as sort of these people that sit up there at the anchor desk, and that's their personality, but it's not. It's so much more than that. Part of their personality makes them passionate and curious, and all these things that I had the pleasure and luxury of sort of witnessing firsthand and spending time with him and just really getting to know him, and sort of helping me put into perspective what my career was going to become and who I wanted to become. You can let it consume you sometimes, or you can do a really good, passionate job, and then at the end of the day, just sort of kick back and have a beer or sit with your family and, watch a movie. So I think it's sort of that well-rounded experience I got from him that sort of has helped me, and what I've loved about working with him.
And John, finishing up?
Finishing up, well, first of all, working with Dan and going out into the world, going across the country, allowed me to be a witness to history, which I thought was fabulous. I mean, that's just from my own point of view. It was just astonishing and fun. I loved every minute of it, including when one time early on when I was working with Dan, and Dan looked at me and said, John, so what do you think it's like working with me? And I said, Dan, working with you is like running a marathon as though it's a 100-yard dash. That's what it's like working with you. And that's true. Hardest working man I ever worked with, a man with a lot of passion, as Jimmy said, a man who, the word that comes to my mind, Dana, is grace. He could do all that work as hard as that and be interested and passionate about things, and he did everything with grace. And it was amazing to watch, and it was an honor to work with him.
After we leave the stage, we're going to introduce our speaker tonight by enjoying a short film highlighting the breadth of Dan's distinguished career. But in the meantime, this is even more fun than it was at lunch. Can we give a hand to We're off.
Turn that off right away.
It was a green jungle hell.
Could you tell us what's happening here? Fill us in on what the situation is.
Governor Wallace is now walking away from the door, apparently capitulating now in his battle against the United States government to prevent 2 Negro students from entering the previously all-white University of Alabama.
How can the House meet its constitutional responsibilities while you, the person under investigation, are allowed to limit their access to potential evidence?
Take your hands off of me unless you're glad to arrest me.
It strikes me that any reasonable person would say that's a record of ineffective leadership.
You said that if you had known this was an arms for hostages swap, that you would have opposed it.
Do you see the role of the president as kind of CEO of the world's largest conglomerate?
Switchboards all over Dallas are still completely swamped with callers who apparently refuse to believe that John F. Kennedy has been shot and killed.
Mr. Watney, can we move into the radar room now? There is the eye of the horse, right there.
Could you explain to me what this stamp is?
Where did you get it?
I got it from someone who told me that you used that to put a different kind of stamp on the meat than the store buyer put on his own meat.
Who can sing now with the same meaning we had before? One stanza of that goes, so beautiful for patriot's dream, that sees beyond the years, thine alabaster cities gleam, undimmed by human tears. We can never sing that song again that way.
Over the weekend, as some of you may have already heard or read, I was assaulted with violence on a Manhattan street.
This race is as wide open as a hobo's mouth at a pie flinging contest.
It's time for one more cup of coffee as the race between Senators Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama is still tighter than Willie Nelson's headband. The worst mosquito in
invasion terrorists plaguing the Texas and Louisiana coasts this summer.
It doesn't get much worse than it is right here.
These Afghan clothes I'm wearing were part of an operation to sneak me and the CBS News film crew into Afghanistan. A round came right over us and landed just over there, about 25 feet.
Somebody's just firing at the tank. You can see him go. Okay, they opened up on the tank now.
It was this picture and dozens of others that prompted an investigation by the U.S. Army.
Respectfully, it is you who invaded another country, not the United States who invaded.
It is true about me, for better or for worse. If you want to see my neck swell, you just try to tell me what to report.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to introduce Dan Rather tonight. To coin a phrase, this is a man who really doesn't need an introduction from me. But I do want to point out his wonderful wife, Jean Rather. Jean, please stand up and be recognized. Dan is going to be interviewed in just a minute here by R.B. Brenner. R.B. is the director of the School of Journalism here at the university's Moody College of Communication. Before coming to the university 3 years ago, R.B. was an editor at the Washington Post, where he was a member of the editorial team that was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in 2008 for the Post coverage of the tragic shootings at Virginia Tech. Please join me to welcome Dan Rather and R.B. Brenner.
And I thought, to begin, one of the things I loved about the last panel was it showed how journalism is a team sport. And when people would see you on the air, people like John and Dana and Jim were integral to your success. So I thought we could start by turning the tables and let you talk about them for a minute or two, about their contributions to your work.
Well, I really appreciate that. First of all, it's an honor to be here, and thank you all for being here. This is sort of a surreal experience, which I haven't quite processed yet. But in answer to your question, I'm very glad you asked the question, and particularly glad you put the premise to it, that television news is a team sport, particularly when played at or near the highest levels. And in the case of the three people here, who I'm happy to say were not just people who work with me, but over the years became really close, dear friends. Jim Murphy, the gentleman who was on your far right, my far left here, is one of the most experienced, most accomplished, most awarded executive producers in the history of television news. One, he started young. He got to a high level when he was fairly young. And among the tough things in big-time television news is once you get on top is to stay there. And it speaks yards about Jim's ability that he's been on top for a long time. And when the history of television news is written, Jim Murphy's name will be there because he has this breadth of experience. And Jim, when he was, I believe, the executive producer of the CBS Evening News for the longest single tenure of anyone who'd been executive producer, he was there for 5 years. And part of the reason of that is that Jim had, first of all, the greater the pressure, the calmer he would get. Secondly, he has a depth of mind, a combination of curiosity and passion and the fact that he's been a lifetime avid reader prepared him for this. But he also has the ability that all of the good executive producers have, whether it's at a local station, a middle-sized market, a big market, or at the network. And that is the ability to see the program as a whole. This is where the teamwork comes in. Look, I like to think on my best days I was a half-decent reporter. And having worked in 60 Minutes for a long time, I'm at least reasonably good at putting together, say, an 8 to 15 minute piece, self-contained piece. But putting together a whole broadcast is a whole other thing. And the ability to envision how all the pieces are going to fit in a half hour or 15 minute or 1 hour broadcast is a rare talent. And particularly to have it to the degree that Jim has, this is one of the keys to his being the team leader every anchorman and anchorwoman dreams of having. Because he could, at 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning, he starts putting together in his head what the whole broadcast may look like. Now, as things develop during the day, you have changes, but he's able to change. But at any rate, Jim Murphy, I can't believe he flew all the way down here today to do this. But every evening news team has to have a strong leader, and Jim was that strong leader. He's done it in the mornings, he's done it at night, he's done it all the way through. So the team has to, in the end, the anchor has to be a leader. And I don't know of a successful network anchor, with the possible exception of myself, who didn't have strong leadership skills. Dana Roberson is a vacuum sweeper reporter. Everybody who works with me and for me is a reporter, but Dana could have made it in the newspaper world of the 1920s. She could have made it as one of the Murrow boys. He didn't have any women, but she would have been one. She's your classic vacuum sweeper reporter. That is, she steeps herself in the written research, spends time in the library, time on the internet, whatever. She, on the telephone all the time developing sources. She talked about how, and she was the key in breaking the Abu Ghraib story, which was a world-class exclusive. She did that because she worked her sources. She mentioned a little bit, but Dana's on the phone all the time, just sometimes saying to people, "Hi, it's Dana, what's going on? Anything I should know about? Okay, thank you, Senator, thank you very much." But one key, I can't say enough about her as a reporter, but one key to Dana, and this, I don't mean to be looking down anyway, but particularly young reporters in the audience are those who aspire to be reporters. Part of what made Dana so effective, and to this day makes her so effective, and part of the keys to the Abu Ghraib story, totally trustworthy. Now, that's trust going up to our anchor person. Dana, and I know this, Dana would crawl on broken glass for me. She would go to hell till hell freezes over and then cut through the ice. She has loyalty going up, she has loyalty going down. From a reporter's viewpoint, from a journalist's standpoint, you have to develop a reputation of being totally trustworthy with sources. And Dana can be a tomb of silence when it's required to be so. And the person who gave her the original tip on the Abu Ghraib story, I don't know of another person anywhere in journalism, print, radio, or television, whom he would have trusted to do that. But he had experience with Dana, and he knew that if he told her, "You have to lose me as a source, they can tear out your tongue, send you to prison, you never can tell my name." He knew that would be the case with Dana. And there's some fundamental things to reporting, but one of them is develop sources and develop tremendous trust with your sources. John Reed, that every anchor person, again, whether it's local or network, you have to have an anchor buddy. You have to have somebody who watches your back and side at all times. And John was the person in the pit when we were doing the studio at the CBS News broadcast studio. And by the way, we were the only ones at that time who did the newscast actually from the newsroom. I'm not criticizing our opposition, but it's important understanding what John did, that most people have a set that looks like a newsroom from which they do the news. But the CBS News, we actually did the news from the newsroom. And the anchor position is built up. Part of that is to do with camera angles. But nonetheless, you're up on a pedestal, if you will. They don't put you there for any sense of royalty. It works because you need a pit of people below you on phones, on computers, who are feeding you material. But there needs to be one point through which all information comes. And John was that point for me. Now, because we had pioneered the business of the style of being a mobile anchor, I realized that that doesn't grammatically stand up. But that is, we took the view when I came to the Evening News that because of developments in satellite and videotape technology, that we could do the Evening News from any place in the world. So we said we're going to distinguish ourselves by developing this as sort of our signature. But John traveled and did the same thing. My point, in the studio, he was literally down in the pit, sometimes in a place like Somalia, which John mentioned we were in, and was a very hairy place, to say the least. There's no pit. You're standing outside, even in the rain, and he's standing just off camera, translating what New York is saying, what they want, translating what people in the field are saying. Just absolutely key man. And you talk about an Iron Man. There's so many things that made John tremendous at his work. And you never met anybody who had more respect for my direct competitors in the anchor chair, Tom Brokaw and Peter Jennings, for most of my career. Both of them tremendous journalists, fierce competitors. But they didn't have what I had. They didn't have John Reed. And particularly when it's big breaking news like 9/11, election night 2000, where we were on the air, it seemed to me, for days at a time. It was Gore versus Bush. Or the Challenger explosion, that kind of breaking news where, in the case of the Challenger explosion or 9/11, no chance to prepare. What you do, you scramble, you get in the anchor chair. It's a little like, to anchor in those circumstances, a little like feeling like an astronaut. You get wired up. My own style was I like to have an earpiece, a different earpiece in each ear, which is, say, one earpiece running to the control room and one earpiece running to John in the editorial function. But you get strapped up and you only have seconds to do it. And for the anchor person, you know, a lot of things are going through your head. For example, I climbed the stairs to get in a chair for a Challenger and for 9/11, just to pick two examples. You know, I have a checklist in my own head of, okay, we don't know much about what's going on. We're going to be on constantly for a while here. The checklist, you know, tell people what we know, tell them what we think we know but haven't confirmed, tell them what we don't know. Got a whole checklist. And at the same time, John is like a boxing corner man. He's whispering in your ear, don't have any place to go. You're going to be on your own for a half hour until we get news. That sort of thing. But John was, you know, that ideal corner man.
So the project that was unveiled earlier is called the Legacy Project. And I tend to think of legacy as backward-looking, sort of the victory lap. I think of you as a journalist for life and still very actively engaged in it. So it's a two-part question. One is, what still drives you? And the second part of the question is, you've covered pretty much the defining issues of the last 5-6 decades. What do you see as the defining issues to cover moving forward, that you would, you know, that you want to have your eye on those balls?
Well, as to the first, that I can be dumb as a fence post about a lot of things, but at least I'm smart enough to know how really lucky I've been. And I'm fond of saying, because it's true that what you see when you have me is a reporter who got lucky, very, very lucky. Now, I dreamed of being a reporter when I was a small child. I'm not quite sure why that was the case. I think it was because my parents were avid newspaper readers. But the only thing I ever dreamed about was being a reporter. I didn't dream about being a television reporter. Television may have existed as early as 1936 or something. But being a reporter to me meant being either a wire service or a newspaper reporter, both of which I later became and was not very good at it. And by the way, the word journalist, until at least the mid-50s, maybe the 60s, I don't ever recall hearing the word. A journalist was a reporter with a cane. but I think in trying to elevate the profession, became journalist. But you know, I've had a dream, a driving dream since I was a child, wanting to be a reporter, and therefore to be able to become a reporter, and then you know, the only question in my mind ever was, could I make a living at it? Which I can mentally hear some of the young aspiring journalists in the room saying that question occurs to me, because journalism is very tough, particularly in the first few years. But at any rate, as, you know, what has driven me the time is always, you know, the star, like a navigational star. It is the unreachable star. But you know, I dreamed of being a great reporter. That's what I wanted to do. That's what I'm still trying to do. That you know, I know what my vulnerabilities are, and I know the mistakes that I've made, and I know the wounds I have. Some of them self-inflicted, some of them still open. But it's good in life to have a kind of impossible dream as well. And you know, I've always had curiosity, and I've always had passion. Never been the smartest person in the room. Most of the time operating at a high network level, I wasn't anywhere near the smartest person in the room most of the time. But I had the dream and I was willing to work hard. So, you know, going forward, that's what has driven me, that's what always has driven me. And you know, I'm now in my 8th decade, pretty hard for me to come to grips with that. But you know, I still want to be as good as I can be. And I feel very thankful about being in journalism, because you know, quality journalism, when it's done well, it counts. It matters. And because that's true, one has a sense in journalism, or at least I have the sense, of relief that you're part of something bigger than yourself. Because when it's done well, it matters. It matters for the country, it matters for the benefit of people. You're outside yourself. It's kind of hard to explain, but you belong to something, you're committed to something bigger than yourself. And that's always been a help in what I call the driving trait. Going forward, as long as I have my health and as long as somebody will allow me to do it, you know, I love covering stories. That's what I'm about. That's what I set out to be. You know, I wanted to be a story hunter, story breaker, storyteller, and I'm still trying to become a good one.
When we were talking at lunch earlier, we talked about, I was struck by our conversation, a lot of it revolved around books, a lot of it revolved around history, and we talked a little bit about the importance of context in broadcast news, particularly for the students in the room. Can you talk about why history matters so much, even if you're a journalist excelling in the now?
Well, I could spend the rest of the evening talking about that. Be relieved I'm not going to spend the rest of the evening talking about it. No, but this is such a very important point, because history helps give context and perspective to what's happening currently. And I wish I had had more history. I had some history in college, but not much. For example, when I went to the Vietnam War, I thought I knew history. But not long after getting there, I realized that I was not an ideal candidate to cover the war. Don't misunderstand me. I gave it everything I had. I would stand on the work. But I had not really studied the ancient Greeks. I barely knew who Thucydides was. Plutarch might as well be Target. I was not, but I learned over time, and the late great Eric Sevareid, who was unquestionably the best writer produced by in electronic news, was early on just telling me, you haven't read enough. I've always been a reader. Your question about what? Always been a reader. Always liked to read, and yes, I prefer if you want to call them that, heavier books. But the point wasn't anything in my educational personal background that was nearly steeped enough in history. But realizing that, I've been in a constant effort to try to play catch up ever since. Because history gives you context and perspective. For example, today, we're living in a very perilous time for the country. I know there can be some argument about that, but that's my opinion, and that's where I stand. I can stand no other place. It's a perilous time for the country. And it's easy to say, well, when we say we've never been through anything like this, that's true. There are many instances in which we've never been through it. But we've been through some really difficult times before. The 1960s with race relations exploding, the Vietnam War exploding. This country went through a terrible civil war. We went through a combination of Depression and World War II. We've been through a lot of tough times before. So what history gives you, and a knowledge of history, even the sort of sketchy knowledge of history I had before I became a more mature correspondent, gives you a chance, at least a chance, to put things in context and into some perspective. Not just historical context, but to some, for example, again, taking the current example, you can say when the president says something, for example, personally attack journalists by name, hoping to intimidate you. Now, from a historical standpoint, this has never happened before. And that's where a study of history sort of helps. You can say, well, certainly President Nixon attacked the press, and we've had other presidents who attacked the press and press institutions, but never personally attack individual journalists and individual journalist operations to anywhere near the extent we went through now. So that's it. Frankly, and I realize I'm sitting in the room of one of the great institutions of higher learning in the country, and that the communications school at this university is one of the great communications schools around. So it's a risk to say it, but I will say it, that I wish those who were training themselves and studying to be journalists would think about taking more history, because some, not all, but some, a lot of what you need to know as a journalist can be learned on the outside, as I did. You start the police beat, you work yourself up. But all of that historical knowledge that you need, beginning with the Greeks and running through the Romans and all of Buddha and the rest, that's hard to get once you're out trying to make a living.
So I'm going to ask one more. I think we just have about 5 minutes or so, so I'm going to ask one more and then give the audience a chance maybe for 2 quick questions. So I want to end with your sort of assessment of the current state of broadcast news. Over the summer, I happened to be in Mexico for a couple of weeks where the English language channels for news were BBC and a couple of the cable US stations. And we would watch BBC for 20 minutes and we might get 15 stories, and they were serious stories. You might get an investigative piece. And a lot of what I got on US cable news was not news. It was a lot of talking heads arguing with each other. I worry a little bit about sort of the current state of broadcast news. Do you share the same concern, or what's your assessment of how things are now?
Well, of course I share. I worry about some of the things that you just mentioned and a lot of other things, but I do want to emphasize that I am by nature and by experience an optimist, and that includes I'm optimistic about journalism, particularly American journalism, where we're headed. So for context, I want that to be. What's happened in our own country on the downside, there are many positive things that have happened, but on the downside, the key to understanding what has happened, I think, is to understand that we've gone through a period in which news, particularly what passes for national news as we once knew it, is in real danger of being overwhelmed, sort of tsunami-like, by entertainment values. Now, entertainment values are very important for a society, for a culture, but they are different from news values. So entertainment values have virtually overwhelmed, particularly on television news. Many programs that call themselves news, even at some of the best news institutions, are in fact designed to be entertainment under the guise of news. So without trying to talk this to death, that we've had, beginning, I would say, 25, 35 years ago, we've had intensely increased corporatization, politicalization, and trivialization of the news. Corporatization in the consolidation of big companies buying up other big companies, to the point where, as we sit here today, by any reasonable analysis, at least 80% of the true national distribution of news is owned by no more than 6 large international conglomerates. Those understand this is not talking anti-capitalism, it's just analyzing what has happened. And therefore, these very large corporations, this is under the corporatization of the news, these very large corporations have a lot of business that they need to do in Washington. They need laws passed, they need regulations eased, they have all kinds of things in Washington. And the power structure in Washington, whether it be at any given time in the hands of Republicans or Democrats, they want the news covered a certain way. So, in many important ways, we've reached the point where news, particularly national distributed news, in many, many cases, and forgive my reporter's French here, you have very big business in bed with very big government. Again, whether that government is in the hands of Republicans or Democrats at the point. And they want news, and by and large, in many cases, get news for their mutual benefit, not for the consumer's benefit, not for the news consumer's benefit. And that has to do with the corporatization and politicalization. Now, as for the trivialization of news, among other things, very large corporations don't like trouble, and and they don't like expenses. So it's much easier to put 5 people in a room shouting about Afghanistan. And by the way, most of the time, none of them have ever been there. Put 5 people in a room shouting about Afghanistan, rather than pay for a full bureau with cameramen and reporters in Afghanistan. So that's one aspect for it. The other aspect for it is that deep digging investigative reporting, which I'm happy to say is having some revival in the last 18 to 20 months. It's expensive, and it frequently causes controversy for corporations, which don't like to have controversy. So in a shorter version, I recognize not as short as I'd hope, I can tell you, I think that's what's happened. But I do want to come back to that there are some signs, some very encouraging signs, that for the last 18 to 20 months, there's been, I call it a revival in investigative reporting. And there's been as much good investigative reporting across the board as there has been in a long, long while, and I find that very encouraging.
So I'm going to try to keep us on time, so I'm going to just go one quick question here and then one there, and then we'll have to wrap up. If you can introduce yourself as well.
My name is Gadir. I'm a physician in town. I'm not a journalist. And I come from Saudi Arabia, and I came at age 27 to the United States, and I'm American now. Back home, news was basically aggrandizing the royal family and saying that the country is in peace and we're all rich and we're good. I came here, and the news is all about disasters, that the world is coming to an end almost. If you hear the news, in a journalist's mind, what is the goal of delivering their piece of news? Do they consider the emotional and mental impact on the listener? When there is I love to hear the news. I hear CBS and BBC all the time, but I feel tense inside. It's scary. What's happening is delivering disasters that are happening around the world that are impacting us and impacting other cultures and other countries. And I go to the Middle East, and they are looking back at us, and they're saying, "Are you sure you're from Texas? Are you sure nobody's after you with a gun?" So how far does journalism go?
I'd like to get to the question.
Yes.
I'd like to get to the core.
So I guess what I'm hearing... The question is, do you have
any sense of how your news are going to impact the listeners? What message are you trying to deliver when you make a piece of news? Is it just to make an announcement?
I appreciate the question. If the core of the question is what impact
yes.
Do we think that the news is it going to have, and what message are we trying to send? Widely believed it may not be, but true it is. Overwhelmingly, most of the journalists I know have the same attitude and would give you a similar answer to the question. That frankly, having been a paid reporter now for almost 70 years, I rarely think about what the impact is going to be. And I don't have a message for you. What I'm trying to be, and what most, what I call, I don't like the word mainstream, traditional journalists are trying to be an honest broker of information. I don't have a message to get to you. I'm not trying for some impact to get to you. Now, having said that's the core mission, is to be an honest broker of information. When putting together the CBS Evening News with my friend Jim Murphy over the years, we sometimes discuss, well, what's news? And one short version of it is news is, this is on a broad scale, news is what people need to know and or want to know. Now, the ideal lead for a newspaper story or the evening news is a story that people need to know and they're really interested in knowing. But that's the criteria of the broadcast. We're going to put these things together in the evening news. We're going to select things on the basis of, is it something people need to know? Is it something you think they want to know? Now, that's the traditional view. My own view of news, which has changed somewhat given what we talked about earlier, the politicalization, corporatization, trivialization of news, that news is what people, the public needs to know, that somewhere, someone, particularly someone in power, doesn't want them to know. That's news. Most of the rest is primarily advertising or propaganda. I wish that's a paraphrase of a quote from someone else. It's not an original quote from me. But that's my own sort of guiding thing now. That's the best I can do for you, but thank you for the question.
Thank you.
And I'm going to ask you to be very brief to the point.
I'll try.
Thanks.
I'm Kyle Rather, no relation. I'm a doctoral student in the radio, TV, film department here in the Moody College, and thank you for coming. I grew up in a CBS house too, and you were always there with us, and appreciate all the work you've done. So my question is about the tools of reporting. So television obviously offered incredible opportunities, right, to show people the world and to really beam into their households, but it offered challenges too, right? You only have a limited amount of time. I don't have to tell you that. I wonder about your thoughts about new technologies and what are the challenges and opportunities that they afford. Now, you use Facebook quite a bit. You obviously you've been on podcasts. There are lots of new technologies that reporters are using and mastering. And so I'm wondering, what do you think some of the challenges and opportunities of those are?
I'm not sure.
So essentially, the opportunities and challenges of new technology. Well, obviously, there's social media, but there's also other advances.
Well, first of all, put me on record that overall in the main, I think the development of the internet is a good thing. I have my concerns about any number of things having to do with the internet and news, but it's a new, almost unbelievably powerful tool. But in trying, and probably struggling to answer your question, I would say, going forward, I remind myself of my own idol growing up, Edward R. Murrow, who in his most famous speech, and the most famous speech ever delivered by any person in television news, talked about television was new. And paraphrasing, he said, you know, this new invention, television, this box of television, it has tremendous potential to inform, illuminate, educate, and can be a powerful tool against human suffering and such things as poverty. But, said Murrow, it can only do that to the extent that we are dedicated to using it for those purposes. Now, here in the second decade of the 21st century, dealing with the internet, I find myself thinking the same way. The internet has almost unfathomable potential to educate, to illuminate, to inform, and to be of value in the battle against the scourges of mankind. But again, only to the extent that we use it for those purposes. And to paraphrase Murrow, he said, otherwise television is just lights and wires in the box. Well, in the internet age, otherwise it's just circuitry in something in your hand. That I do think that going forward we have to be fairly careful about understanding that to be an informed citizen, to be an informed news consumer now requires more work and more time of the citizen, of the consumer, than before, because there are so many places. I've listened to some great journalism being performed on the internet, and there's some great journalism being done on television, say nothing in newspapers, but you have to work hard to find it. Thank you very much for your question.
Thank you.
We should quit.
Nope, I'm sorry, we're past our time, I'm sorry. Turn it over to Don. Thank you, Don.
Thank you, Don. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. Safe journey home. Thank you.
RB. I mean, they're already ready.
You've given a lot of time to listen.
Yeah, I know. I don't want to crowd.